for joining in this session, those of you who've been able to do so in person. And for those of you that have chosen to listen to this, I really wanted to bring it because the conditions of esoteric training have been very foundational to the work that I've brought from the very beginning. In fact, they were always there on every flyer in the good old days when flyers were put up, when there was a course on. And they were always there on every web page, partly because they are so foundational to the work, but also because my sense was if somebody read those and said, I can't get on board with that, they probably would not be able to engage with the work that occurs when we're trying to work on the esoteric path, when we're trying to build an understanding of inner development and meditation. So why meet them again? Well, I meet them again often and penetrate them often, as one always does, I think, with things that really are foundational. But I've also felt that in these times that we've been facing, they have been quite like life rafts in supporting individuals not to fall into the materialism that is grasping hold of. It seems at a speeding rate. In one way, we could say materialism has been working at an intensive rate for a long time. But some things happened over the last few years that I feel like we're all recognizing has created a shift in how we're having to meet life. So as we're working towards the Michaelmas preparation, and Michaelmas really supports us in relationship to the being of Michael, we are supported deeply in overcoming materialism. I thought it would be very useful for those wanting to enter into that to also contemplate these conditions. It's interesting that we often think about the 6 subsidiary exercises are foundational hygienic exercises, and yet you could do them and be a thorough materialist. But you can't enter into the conditions of esoteric training and maintain that stance. So in their nature, they work to build capacities that overcome materialism in us. And in that way, there is this real engagement from our own soul strength with the being of Michael in this task that stands before us. Now, I've brought them in a slightly different correlation to which Steiner gives them. He starts from the first condition with the physical, then the second condition, each relating to the different sheaves of the human being. But it's also useful to see their reflective correlation and how, although we may experience ourselves as being drawn to the inner development path out of the first condition and surmount them, they can often be worked together and support one another. So I wanted to start with the central condition of esoteric training, which is connected to the sun and the I consciousness. I'll try not to repeat what's in Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, because you can read it there, and it is obviously from the horse's mouth, but I wanted to bring aspects that might be helpful in what we're meeting today and how it might help us penetrate that. So the first condition, the fourth condition, and we'll start with the fourth condition, is to really come to the conviction that the true being lies in the interior and not the exterior. Now, when we first meet certain words, we always are able to be in a certain amount of agreement, perhaps. Particularly if you've already engaged with anthroposophy, those thoughts are not at all discordant. But as we penetrate into the condition, we might recognize in it layers and layers of what is meant by the exterior and what is meant really by the interior. What is actually the true being? And this is something that I think we're becoming more confronted with in our times, but also trying to find a right relationship to in some way. So when I think about my external being, of course I could say this body, this physical body, may not be a part of this true being. Then we look at this sex or gender of this body. Maybe that's not a part of this true being. We contemplate things like our temperament. And as I pull away all of these things that are not a part of the interior, but of the exterior, we start to recognize actually there's so much more of me that is founded on the exterior. And so therefore can't be a part of this true being of self. And meditation for many people awakens this in a really experiential way. It allows them to put to one side everything or every aspect of self and still remain in a beingness, I consciousness, even though all the other things, including our thoughts and feelings, are no longer merged in our consciousness, but are in a way distinctly separate from that I experience. And it's a great advantage of meditation, because then one really knows the true being. But at the same time, we can see that there is a certain purposefulness in everything that is this outer self, the exterior self. In one way, we could even say it this way, that everything that is me is my karma. Everything that is me is my karma. The bodily vehicle, the temperament, actually the capacities of soul that I have to meet the world. We often think of karma as everything that comes towards me from the outer world, which of course there is, these events of our life, the people we meet. We could all say that is my karma, but I see everything that is exterior is my karma. So I am, or the me that I have, that I embody in order to engage with the world and the capacities of which I can meet the world, are also my karma. So when we are working with the inner development path in a very deep way, we are building a relationship to overcoming the desires of the individual soul, desires of which are usually based on our limitations. And all of our limitations are based on our karma. So as we take hold of ourselves, we're not just looking at the outer world as the things outside of me, but even me is outer world. And the power of that transformative power to take hold of that lives in the eternal being. So when we think of the individual soul, we consider it as the limited self. And as we overcome its limitations, its karma, we are liberated from the limitations, and our individual soul may connect, therefore, with everything beyond what it's limited to. The world soul, the wisdom, the Sophia, that which lives beyond the limitation. But my limitations belong to my karma, the limitations of even the conditioning that has been installed in me. What allows certain experiences of your life to take imprint and continue to repeat themselves, seeking resolution, usually in the outer world, that's connected to our karma. So I wanted to start with this because it brings a certain adjustment to what is exterior, what is interior. Because when we start to face ourselves, we are actually facing levels of limitation and overcoming that limitation. Certainly in the Eastern path, it might be spoke about more as desire, the desire that needs to be overcome. As Buddha said, desire only one thing, to be desireless. Or at least they said that that's what he said. But we are working towards liberation, towards freedom. And there is something incredibly liberating about recognizing that this is yours to work with. Both in what approaches you from the world, which your own higher eyes help to activate into your life, but also what is in you to meet it. And then what is beyond that, that's not reaction, but ability to respond from a new place in oneself, a transformative place. And it becomes that which empowers the soul capacities to have the strength to do the inner work. And that's really, in a way, a very true statement that without your own soul strength, there isn't really progress. But everyone has within them a certain, I'm going to use these words, a certain amount of transformative power. Steiner gives this picture that if you cross the threshold having not utilized that, perhaps for some reason you pass early, then that transformative power continues to work on through those that we have loved and connected with. So we all have this capacity in us. And of course, we also have this karma of our past, which can be so assistive to us. And often when we think of karma, we really thinking it's just the most simplistic form of cause and effect. But when we try to penetrate into it, it can't be in the way of which we assess it in the world. And Steiner gives this image of somebody that is has the ability to not be judgmental in one life. Could be the metamorphosis of their ability to play a musical instrument well in a past life. Now, we wouldn't normally associate that as karma, but it gives us this recognition that whatever we're doing in this life, through this encounter with this existence, is not just born of the past, but becomes also our future. And there are strengths that each one of us have, capacities. And we all come with a transformative power of the I. And it's in our hands whether we initiate our lives into these esoteric training, esoteric studies. And if we ask what is that, in many ways it is helping us make whole the world, because the material nature of the world seems to bring a split or a separation. And in another way, each individual, as they walk on that path of initiation, is contributing to the progress of humanity that is willed by the gods. And there are also, as we're aware of through this experience of life, but also through Rudolf Steiner's many insights, is that there are forces at work which divert this trajectory of a future willed by the gods, to be a future that diverts our progress. So each one of us taking hold of the path adds something to it. And that's really spoken about in these conditions. But I want to start with the first condition. And if I would just put them up in Steiner's words, because I won't necessarily use the words exactly. Let's have a look at them on the board. Here we are. So the first condition, the student should pay heed to the advancement of bodily and spiritual health. And when we read into that condition, obviously he's speaking about the health of the soul as well, mental health. Now this first condition, and we might just take those off, we can bring them up again. This first condition, first on the rung, as it were, that we enter into, has in the past, as all the conditions, been held in place by our relationship to the spiritual world. In a way, our earthly and cosmic relationship gives rise to a certain amount of what we would say as physical and soul health. And what underpins that health is linked very strongly to the rhythms of life, our bodily rhythms, the rhythms of the cosmos. When we think of celebrating the festivals, we're looking at bringing in these spiritual rhythms. Rhythms are holding us constantly in a state of health that we are unaware of just how much we're held. We have the rhythms of our breathing, the rhythms of the heart, the rhythms of sleeping and waking, the rhythms of the digestion. And they're actually held in, to some degree, by this cosmic relationship to these planetary beings, the light of the sun, the rhythms of the moon, these various celestial forces that connect to our health and the health and well-being of our bodily organization. And because the body has that basic wellness, the soul can use that mirror to reflect its health in. And this relationship or correlation between soul health and bodily health in anthroposophical medicine has always been recognized, how important it is to keep that connection. And many would know that something's happening in the rhythms, whether it be connected to the rhythms of the seasons, but also through what has taken place with COVID. COVID has disturbed humanity. And how it's disturbed it if I look for the heart of how it's disturbed it is connected to these rhythms. Whether you could say the virus itself, which addresses that, or the way it was handled by the powers that be, or the vaccinations and how that affects the human being, it's hard to distinguish that. And one might say that there is a doorway to that because these really strong rhythms were already beginning to waver in us. So when Steiner speaks about this condition, he says really staying physically healthy is about warding off harmful influences. And in turn, that will give us a certain amount of soul health because of that reflection. But what we're seeing in the world is a shift in that. I know there are certain countries that are following this more clearly than others. Some countries are blatantly choosing not to. So, for instance, in the UK now, there's an excess mortality of around 1,500 deaths per week, not from COVID, just from other things. The level of mental health disturbances that have taken place. So what used to be, in a way, an innate state, that in a way, that through our karma we came in with a certain amount of soul and spiritual and physical health, and that as someone walking on that path of esoteric training would seek to advance that. It now appears that we need to be proactive if we are to stay physically and soul well. It isn't actually a given. And whether we can recognize this from the multiple ways of which those rhythms have been thrown out, for instance, the light that we meet off the screen at night, which is changing the melatonin, our relationship to the light of the day, and that deep connection that's shifting our ability to be in a natural rhythm. Whether it is those rhythms or whether it is just how much our world is being altered. And of course, when we think of the lockdowns, nobody automatically thinks, oh, it's the rhythms that's going to cause the trouble. Don't disturb that many rhythms in the human being. But yeah, we're going to it's the masks, or it's this, or it's that, or it's not socializing. And it's all of those things. But underlying good health, the innate ability that so many of us can get away with not eating well, not doing the right thing, and our bodies still maintain certain things, is all because of the great rhythm that supports us. So now there is a sense in many experiences, and those that have had COVID can often feel it afterwards, those that have had their relationship to it in one way or another, that there is something that isn't just coming back. There has to be a little bit more activity, proactiveness in rebuilding this balance. So what was to pay advancement? Of course, I think in the great picture, the human being or humanity must be ready for this level of taking this thing that is given a little more into our own hands. And whichever way one recognizes that, we are beginning to see that the materialism that is grasping hold of us can be disturbing very foundational processes in what even makes the human being well. So when the body is thrown out of the rhythms, our soul life is also created out of balance. This makes our thinking and even our choices change. So that snowball effect is corrected when we can re-establish this really healthy rhythms in our life again. Now, many people would know that through the meditative path, it's often suggested that the meditation occur rhythmically. Now, to begin with, it's useful to just do the meditation when you know you're going to be able to do it, and you're building a capacity to grasp an exercise or enter into that place of tranquility. But if one is able to do it rhythmically and the rhythms are installed, something else is taking place there, because it's our rhythmical relationship to the spiritual world, which we do at night in sleep. And if we start to do that in the day in our meditation, that rhythmical connection is what gives us this greater spiritual support, because the spiritual world then come towards us in that moment of that practice that we put aside every day at the same time of day. But it's an interesting thing because it is engaged out of our own individual will to do that. It's not the sun rising and waking the body up because the rhythms connecting to the physicality. It is something that we do completely out of our own freedom. So that can be one of the most important health-giving supports to ourselves in these times, is to rhythmically bring in a practice where we turn towards that place in which the outer self is not dominant. So these conditions are really like fortresses, because they are a part of who we are. Even though on the development path, we are to awaken to these things consciously. When we actually awaken to them, we see how much we've already been held in them. But we are awakening to them consciously and attempting to advance them. And if they are becoming drawn into the realm of materialism, our physical and mental health is being pulled into that realm. And we are noticing these greater rhythms being thrown out of people's lives. And many, many therapists are recognizing this. Various people I speak to, the struggle people are having with sleep nowadays. The struggle we have to just live a rhythmical life. And the effects of that on anxiety, the effects of that on depression, the effects of that on our mental health. So the impact of these last few years has had a collective impact which is being estimated at causing more deaths than COVID. But there is something in our ability to meet this that means that we're more ready. And we saw that with these events, that even though it could have pulled us away from the inner work, for many it drew them closer to it. So this first condition is something that would be significant to work with greater consciousness. This advancement of physical and spiritual health. The great way that we know it's already held for us is in this realm of rhythm. How do we participate in that? So what I've been suggesting to therapists is not to just treat the COVID, but to then look at what rhythms are thrown off afterwards as well. Can you follow that? See what's different? Because that is where we might get these long COVID issues and consequential effects, because all of those rhythms also keep in check our chronic states that really are, for many of us, sleep in us because they're kept in check until we're confronted in this way. And that's one of the things that we're seeing is those that have any underlying illnesses are being brought to the surface. So with myself and my colleagues, we've talked about this, what out of what we understand and know in our different modalities can we do to meet this? And how do we meet this for early childhood? How do we really do what's needed more, not less, because of the way things have changed? How would we meet that in education? How are these very significant aspects of the rhythms of the day in the world of a child? How do we meet that in the different roles that we have in our relationship to others? And so for myself, I felt like bringing it through the conditions of esoteric training was the first step. And the second step, or the second condition, which is of course connected to that, because we all meet this condition in our own individual way, this ability to see ourselves as a coordinated link in the whole of life. And a teacher would work with this question differently than perhaps a health practitioner, or perhaps someone that's working out of inner development. We would try to meet this question out of our task, and at the same time, we all meet it as individuals, because everything that's occurring around us, we can ask that question: how am I related to these events? How are we connected to the struggles of the wider community? How is what's taking place in me affecting what's taking place in the world around me? Now, this aspect is correlating us to what is also under some kind of bombardment today. Because when we ask that question about this coordinated link in the whole of life, we realize how deeply engaged we are with life. In fact, it deepens our relationship to life when we take it into that consideration. When we really take up that idea that the relatedness that we have to those that we meet has something to do with us, it deepens our connection. And at the same time, where that word of connection is being used to create superficial links to others. So we just skim through life. We Netflix our life, or whatever it is that we do, to not go deep into those relationships, to not make those connections more important. And if we were to do this, if we were to enter into this coordinated link with the whole of life, as Steiner gives this image, we wouldn't just be considering our love for humankind, but actually for all existence, because we begin to see this correlating relatedness. Actually, I think I have a quote here from, this is Hildegard, a Christian mystic. Everything that's in the heavens, on earth, and under the earth is penetrated with connectedness, penetrated with relatedness. So she's got there into that real deep picture. Everything is penetrated with connectedness, penetrated with relatedness. And we meet these realities because we begin to realize that what we've done to certain parts of the world has its effect. But how do we live with that esoterically? And our task would then be to deepen those connections, to not separate ourselves, but to deepen those relationships. And that will come under stronger discord. Well, we're seeing that actually. We're seeing that in the world as these material forces structure into a sort of calcification of our inner spaces. We're not just seeing that effects on our general health and well-being, we're seeing it on our effects of our connectedness or relatedness. And of course, the great positives are arising where people recognize how important that is, how important it is to build stronger connections, stronger community. And I want to come back to this fourth condition, why it's so central, so that we can always be recognizing and assessing for ourselves, where does that desire arise from? The desire of the individual soul can be out of a limitation. And so in its limitation, it might want to find its tribe. It's a kind of limited connection. Or you see these impressions that come through the desires of the individual soul, which are not liberating to the individual and therefore the connections around them. So it's always useful to penetrate your individual desires. This desire that you might have to own a property, for instance. Where does that arise from? Would it not be useful to penetrate the desire? It's not a question of whether we own it or don't own it. A question of where that desire arises from. Because if it's a limitation, it can be the unfreedoms leading our lives. The karma leads our life. And of course, what karma will do is bring us face to face with the error of ourselves. It's its nature. But we can also penetrate those desires. So when we recognize certain realities, that, for instance, to see myself as a coordinated link in the whole of life, and we recognize that as a deepening of relationship, the limited self has something always to say about that. Well, that will look like this. This will mean this. There'll be self and other. How do we kind of continue to expand across those limitations? Because this fourth condition helps us to keep in harmony or work in balance and work towards freedom of the others. So I'll just move to the third condition, because in a certain sense, therein lies the good work. And in a way, when we look at this process of transformation, the awakening of this capacity leads us to transform what lives in the astral body first. But nevertheless, the conditions arise in this form. So our thoughts and feelings are as important to the world as our actions. They're actually important to the world and to the world of which will become my world in the future. Our thoughts and feelings, which we think belong to just purely our interior space, actually are part of the outer world that's conditioned or impressed upon them. There was this recent paper from Stanford University that shows that we have 90% of our thoughts are exactly the same every day. That's extraordinary. 90% of our thoughts are exactly the same thoughts we're having. And so those thoughts, rethought. And what's so interesting about the inner path is we must be able to go beyond those limited thoughts, so that it's not 90% of the just the same, but we're increasing our capacity for thoughts we have never thought before. To go beyond actually just the 90%, so perhaps we have only 50% of the same thoughts every day, and the other thoughts are something new. But it's also to go beyond the capacity of our feelings. Now, that may sound strange, because we often think of the path in anthroposophy as not a feeling path, but it's actually a deeply feeling path. One must be able to go beyond the limited personal emotion and feel much more than one would feel in our everyday life. To be able to manage greater depth of feeling, greater capacity, and also penetration of thought. So these limitations that we are given open us to a world beyond the limitations. Now, in one sense, we have boundaries because we can become conscious within the boundary. In fact, we need a skin to have consciousness in the realm of which we're in. So the skin of the spirit self brings us consciousness in other realms of being, and the skin of the bodily self that allows us consciousness here. So it's not about not having that boundary or that skin, but how much do we live to the fullness of our boundaries? Or how much are we living just into this incredible limited space of the karma or the conditions? And to go beyond that, to be able to reach those boundaries of my own existence, when we are really confined to just a small portion of what's possible for each of us. And we become so more aware of that as we tread that path, extending beyond the limitations of one's karma, which is of the me. I am my karma. And so we can extend that, and extending that in ourselves changes our whole relationship to the world, and also therefore to the future. So your thoughts and feelings are as important to the world as your actions. And just think of how limited scoped our thought and feeling life can be, or not just the fact that we think in a lack of creativity, but that we don't go beyond what we've already thought before. So coming back to the fourth one, so much is connected to this awakening here in the various ways of which we can come to that. To distinguish between I and what's not I, and to understand our part in the ability to extend ourselves and therefore the wider world. We're going on to the fifth condition, which connects us to Mars, a force that's strong in the cosmos at the moment. Steadfastness. Now, some people could take, if you haven't really broken open number 4, you could take that steadfastness based on something that you want, that you personally desire. I desire more money. I desire a house. I desire not to have difficulty, whatever it might be that the desire may be. And therefore, that resolution coming from that place, as Steiner gives, doesn't have any effect on your inner development, because the resolution is created out of desire. Although every force begins to make its way in the world, it's not stopped once it's put out in the world. It is useful to know that your resolutions have come from a place of which you can align yourself to. Now that for each of us may be different things, in the sense that it's not a thing at all. It may be steadfastness to love, or to the divine spiritual world, or the path of inner development. But it becomes something that you feel that you can align your growth and development to, not something that the limited self prefers, wants. Because in itself, it will create its own karma to be met. And that's why it links us really to this spirit self. I've often talked about how important steadfastness is. In some schools, it's often spoken about as single-pointedness. It's like my orientation, to fix oneself on the star of which you're orientated to. And for that person, they will say, well, that's what it's all about. That's why I do everything that I do. For that. And although John Lennon said it was for Yoko, that probably is not quite the right direction. We're thinking about what really, regardless of all those things, which really orientates us. And then, of course, that steadfastness may change if we realize that orientation is no longer where we need to be putting our energy for one reason or another. Now, there are different ways to deepen our relationship to these conditions, but I'm just bringing another way of connecting to them. And in a certain way, these are easy to jump over, because steadfastness, okay, we've got steadfastness, we've got to keep going no matter what. But to what? Out of which resolution? And it's the same with the 6, where we look at gratitude for everything that we're favoured. It's so easy in a certain way to just say, yes, I understand that. But not so easy, like with all the other conditions, to actually bring that into a part of our living reality, where our life becomes ordered based on working through those conditions, working with those conditions, which brings us to the 7th, which means that our life is not in contradiction. And if, in a sense, if we're not in contradiction and we're not in conflict within ourselves, that changes our relationship to others. And in one way or another, the great difficulties we're seeing in the world at this time, all of this conflict, all of these contradictions, actually, for me, suggest that we are waking up to these conditions, but we wake up to them in the hard way. It's almost as though this first condition that is given to us to work with more proactiveness, because in one way we're ready, eventually all of them, because they are connected to esoteric training, which means they're connected to the future of humanity. They will be in our hands and not just woven unconsciously. And so we see the fallout of something before we are able to take it up and transform it. So this gratitude, I remember when I first started to practice anthroposophical medicine and homeopathy in my 20s, and many of the older anthroposophists in the community booked in to see me. And I was interested in that because one of them said, well, you know, you're beginning and you need to learn. So how else are you going to learn unless we turn up and you have someone to learn on? That is what a extraordinary thought. That for me to become skilled, I needed people to work with. And those one-to-one consultations only developed out of other people showing up, really. What if they never turned up? What if they never turned up and said, here, I'm going to pay you to train on me? And my work could never take off in that way. And so there is this really interesting relationship we have today with this path. It's so very Michaelic that we are always teachers and students simultaneously. You're never a teacher alone. If you're only a teacher, we're missing something of this gratitude for everything we're favoured. So we recognise the student in us all the time, regardless of the position. And sometimes that happens that you go beyond those one-to-one consultations because it is a part of your own karma and destiny, and you work in communities. And I think of all the communities that I went to, and they helped to shape and form me, and the mistakes that were made, and they helped to shape and form me. And in a certain sense, it's such an illusion that someone comes to bring a community something. No, we come to meet and we work each other. And what the fallout of that can be is if we forget the actual reality of this Michaelic time. And so it is when you're working for me at the moment on the internet, when I'm trying to understand, this is not a community in the same way. I don't come in and try and feel into who these individual people are and what the skin of this community is. So something else has to be trained. And so it can't go just based on that individual's need or this particular group's need. It has to have an echo of what's taking place in the wider world. And I think whenever any one of us penetrates our life in any way, to say, how did I get to here, to this moment, to this experience? What's all of the people, all of the beings, all of the forces at work? Then we begin to see how very deep this realm is. And we see its correlation to the transforming of the etheric body, to see myself as a coordinated link in the whole of life, and to be grateful for everything of which we're favoured. So as we step towards this preparation for Michaelmas, of which many of us do as a rhythm, as a part of that soul spiritual health, which in a way is so useful in our communities today, to consider how do we have those rhythms together, and the festivals have often been that place. We know that we're stepping into a challenge of materialism that has just penetrated a realm that in the past it didn't seem to be able to push through. So it's, Steiner gave that picture that inner development would become a necessity, or is a necessity. But it becomes clearer and clearer that our conscious participation is going to be required for some of these foundational processes, like physical and soul health. So I know that various members of my colleagues and the team in their various ways are working towards what we can offer and support in that through the different areas. And I'm sure it's worth us all contemplating in our own way. How do we hold that realm strongly out of ourselves when it is not so easy to meet because of the structure of the material world around us? Well, thank you all for coming along to this. It's very brief. I felt like I could do a day on each, but keeping it hygienic, keeping it healthy. And yeah, very good to see you all.